The Nevada desert was a vast cathedral of silence. Every grain of sand shimmered under the white fire of the noon sun. Every gust of wind whispered like a memory that refused to die. Cole Brennan walked alone along the jagged trail, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The weight of his pack pressed against his shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the weight inside his chest. 3 years had passed since Afghanistan, yet every sound, the crack of a rock underfoot, the dry hiss of wind, still made his muscles tighten. At 53, Cole looked strong enough to wrestle the desert itself, but his eyes told the truth: a man carrying ghosts. He'd come out here for the same reason he always did, to outwalk the noise in his head. The Mojave offered something no therapist ever could: silence that didn't pity him. The desert didn't ask questions. It simply existed, untamed and merciless, a mirror to his own fractured soul. At the ridge, he paused to catch his breath. Sweat rolled down his temples and into the sunburned creases of his face. Below him stretched a valley of rust and gold, the kind of landscape that made a man feel both small and eternal. He unscrewed his canteen, 3 swallows left. Not enough. He tightened the cap again, scanning the horizon. And then he saw movement, a flicker of white against the muted earth. He raised his binoculars, heart quickening. A herd of wild Mustangs flowed across the desert floor like a living current. 7, maybe 8, but one was different. A white mare so luminous she seemed carved from sunlight itself, her mane catching the breeze like silver fire. Beside her, a young foal, its coat nearly as pale, stumbled and danced at her side. Cole lowered the binoculars, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're real," he whispered. "You made it out here." He leaned forward for a better look, and the earth betrayed him. The cliff edge gave way beneath his boot with a dry, cracking sound. For a single, weightless heartbeat, he was suspended between sky and stone. Then gravity took him. The world spun into chaos, sand, rock, sky colliding in a violent blur. His shoulder slammed against a ledge, his leg twisted beneath him. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his body as he tumbled down the slope until everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, the world was on fire. The sun had not moved. His canteen was gone. His right leg throbbed with a deep, splintering agony. He tried to move, screamed instead. His ribs ached with every shallow breath. His head was sticky with blood. A single word escaped him: help. But the desert swallowed it whole. Cole lay there for what felt like hours, drifting between lucidity and darkness. Flies buzzed near his face. The smell of iron and dust filled his nose. He forced himself to remember his training. Assess. Breathe. Conserve energy. The soldier in him clung to routine, even as the man beneath it wanted to surrender. He knew the odds. He'd hiked far from any main trail. No GPS signal, no radio, no one expecting him for days. A helicopter wouldn't find a shadow in this emptiness. He stared at the sky, that merciless blue expanse, and wondered if dying out here would finally bring silence. As evening bled into night, the temperature dropped fast. The desert's cruel paradox, scorching by day, freezing by night. His fingers trembled. He tried to pull his torn jacket around him, but the pain in his ribs stopped him cold. His vision blurred. Stars began to bloom overhead, brilliant and unfeeling. He focused on one bright, steady, and whispered, "If this is it, let it be quiet." Then he heard it. A sound soft as a heartbeat, hooves on sand. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, or his brain fading into hallucination. But the sound grew nearer, deliberate, rhythmic. He turned his head with effort, and there she was, the white mare from the ridge. She stood in the moonlight, her coat glowing faintly like she'd carried the stars down to earth. Her nostrils flared as she caught his scent. The foal lingered behind her, nervous but curious. Cole blinked hard. "I'm losing it," he murmured. But she didn't vanish. The mare took a cautious step closer, then another. Cole froze, afraid to move, afraid to scare away whatever mercy the desert had sent him. The mare lowered her head, breath warm against his cheek. The smell of dust and wild sage filled his senses. "Hey there," he whispered, his voice a rasp. "You shouldn't be here." The mare exhaled softly, as if answering him. Then, to his disbelief, she folded her legs and lay down beside him. Her body blocked the wind that had been cutting through his thin jacket. The foal hesitated before curling against his other side, its small frame trembling but brave. Heat seeped into his bones, slow and steady. The pain dulled. For the first time since his fall, Cole felt something like peace. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Darkness took him again, but this time it was gentle. When he awoke, dawn had brushed the horizon with gold. The cold had not killed him. The mare and foal were still there, their coats dusted with the colors of sunrise. She rose gracefully, shook sand from her mane, and looked down at him with eyes that seemed almost human. "Guess you're real after all," Cole croaked. He tried to sit up, and pain lanced through his leg. The foal startled, then pranced a few steps away before circling back. The mare snorted, pawing lightly at the ground. Her gaze locked onto him steady, assessing. Cole knew he needed water. His lips were cracked, his tongue a dry stone in his mouth. "You two should go," he whispered. "Find your herd." But the mare didn't move. She tossed her head, snorted again, and turned to the foal, letting out a short, commanding sound. The foal trotted off a few yards, then stopped and looked back at him. It let out a sharp, impatient whinny, like a child urging an adult to follow. "What are you trying to say?" he muttered. The foal trotted back, nudged his hand, and ran forward again, then looked back. It repeated this twice more. Cole frowned. "You want me to come with you?" The foal pawed the sand and bobbed its head once, an almost comical gesture of affirmation. He stared at it, half amused, half disbelieving. This is insane. But staying meant death. Moving, no matter how impossible, meant a chance. He braced his hands in the sand, teeth clenched, and dragged himself forward. Agony tore through his leg, but he kept going, one painful crawl at a time. The foal stayed beside him, patient, matching his pace. The mare moved ahead, waiting at each rise until he appeared again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had dissolved into the rhythm of pain and breath. When his vision began to tunnel, a new sound reached him. The faint trickle of running water. He lifted his head. Ahead, the mare stood beside a narrow stream, glinting in the morning sunday. Cole laughed a hoarse, broken sound that turned into a sob. "You found me water," he said, dragging himself the last few feet until he could plunge his hands into the cold current. He drank until his stomach cramped, then splashed water over his face and neck. The pain was sharp, but it was life. The mare drank beside him. The foal dipped its muzzle into the stream and flicked droplets toward him, playful, almost teasing. Cole leaned back against the rock, panting. "You two are something else." The desert was quiet again, but not empty anymore. He could hear the steady breathing of the animals, the whisper of the stream, the hum of existence itself. He knew he should focus on survival, splint his leg, ration, water, but exhaustion pulled at him like gravity. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, the sun was higher. The mare and foal were still near, grazing on sparse tufts of grass. Their presence felt deliberate, protective. Cole tore strips from his shirt and used 2 straight branches to brace his broken leg. Each tug of fabric made him grit his teeth, but when it was done, the pain dulled enough for him to think straight. He surveyed the landscape. Somewhere to the west, faint dust rose against the horizon. Maybe a storm, maybe something else. The foal lifted its head, ears pricked toward the distance. The mare did the same, nostrils flaring. Cole followed their gaze. His vision blurred under the glare, but he could make out a line of movement faint, rhythmic. Dust, shimmering in the heat. Not a storm, not natural. Riders. He froze. Out here, that could mean anything. Park rangers, ranchers, smugglers, or worse. The foal let out a soft sound, restless. The mare shifted her weight, torn between instinct and curiosity. Cole swallowed, heart pounding. "What do you see out there?" he whispered. The mare turned her head toward him, eyes steady. For a second, he could have sworn there was understanding in them, like she was trying to tell him something. Then the wind changed, carrying the distant thrum of hooves or engines. The foal whinnied. The mare's muscles tensed. Cole reached for the broken remains of his pack, found nothing useful, no weapon, no flare, not even a knife. Just him, his injuries, and 2 wild horses standing between him and whatever was coming. He drew a slow, painful breath, forcing calm into his voice. "Easy, girl. Whatever it is, we'll face it." The dust cloud grew larger. Sunlight caught on metal helmets, maybe, or rifles. The mare moved to stand between him and the approaching figures. The foal pressed close to her flank, trembling. Cole's pulse hammered. If they were rangers, it was salvation. If not, the horizon shimmered, and a faint glint of sunlight flashed off something metallic, perhaps a badge, or perhaps the barrel of a gun. He squinted against the glare, whispering to himself, "Who the hell are you?" The sound of engines or hooves grew louder. The mare snorted sharply, pawing at the ground. Cole gritted his teeth, bracing for whatever would emerge from the shimmering haze. And then, just as the first shapes began to materialize through the dust, the foal lifted its head and let out a high, urgent cry, half warning, half call for help, echoing across the empty desert. The sound carried for miles. And somewhere beyond the heat waves, something answered. Dawn crept across the desert like a slow heartbeat. The sky blushed in pale rose, gold bleeding along the horizon. Cole Brennan blinked awake to the taste of dust on his lips, the ache of a body held together by grit and will. The pain in his leg was a dull roar now, his ribs grinding with each breath. And yet he was alive. Beside him, the white mare stood watch, her silhouette bathed in the soft morning glow. Her coat shimmered faintly, like snow catching first light. The foal lingered nearby, ears twitching, eyes wide and curious. For a long moment, Cole simply stared. In a world that had stripped him of faith, this sight felt like proof of something divine. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered. His voice was raw, a rasp dragged across gravel. The mare flicked her ear toward him, but didn't move away. Cole reached for the small stream, their miracle from the night before, and drank greedily, though the water burned his cracked lips. He splashed some over his face, washing away the dried blood and dust. Every movement was agony, but pain meant life. The foal stepped closer, nostrils flaring, then darted back with the skittishness of youth. Cole chuckled softly. "Brave little thing, aren't you?" The mare pawed the sand gently, her gaze fixed on him. It wasn't fear, it was assessment, like she was still deciding what he was. Cole studied her posture, noting the old scars along her flank. She'd survived fights, predators, droughts, and yet she'd chosen to stand guard over a broken human. "You shouldn't still be here," he murmured. "Go find your herd." The mare snorted softly and looked toward the west. The foal mimicked her, turning its head in the same direction. Cole followed their gaze, nothing but endless desert and a haze of light that shimmered above the dunes. He didn't know why, but it felt like a signal. When the mare began walking, the foal trotted beside her, and then the foal stopped, turned, and looked back at him. Its eyes caught the morning sun, dark and bright all at once. Cole frowned. What now? The foal took a few steps toward him, then back toward its mother. Again and again. Cole let out a disbelieving laugh. "You trying to get me killed or saved?" The foal whinnied once short, sharp. Cole sighed. "All right, kid, lead the way." He braced himself on his elbows and began the excruciating process of crawling. His arms trembled under his own weight, his legs screaming each time he shifted. But the foal waited patiently, sometimes brushing its muzzle against his hand, as if to keep him moving. The mare stayed a few yards ahead, her presence constant, calm, commanding. The sun climbed higher, and the heat returned with a vengeance. By mid-morning, it felt like breathing fire. Cole's skin burned, sweat drying instantly on contact with air. His vision blurred, the edges of the world rippling like melted glass. He lost track of how long he crawled. The foal's rhythmic steps became his only focus follow. The sound, the shadow, the heartbeat of life. At last, he collapsed against a rock, chest heaving. "That's it," he rasped. "I'm done." But then he heard it again, the faint sound of water. He lifted his head. The mare stood just beyond the next ridge, beside a thin ribbon of stream cutting through the desert floor. The foal was already drinking, splashing its muzzle in delight. A sob tore from his throat, half laughter, half disbelief. "You found me water twice," he whispered. He dragged himself the last few feet until the cool touch of the stream met his hands. He drank until he couldn't anymore, then splashed his face, feeling life crawl back under his skin. The mare lowered her head to drink beside him, unafraid. The foal nudged his shoulder, as if impatient for acknowledgement. Cole smiled through the pain. "All right," he said hoarsely. "I owe you two my life. Guess that makes us even now." But deep down, he knew it didn't. He rested for hours, letting the shade of a rock face protect him from the afternoon sunday. The mare and foal stayed near, sometimes grazing, sometimes lying still. The steady rhythm of their breathing soothed him. He hadn't felt such peace since before the war. When he woke again, the sun had shifted west. The sky had that golden hue that hinted at approaching evening. The air was thick and still. The mare suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked. The foal froze. Cole followed their gaze. In the far distance, a line of dust rose like smoke, the same one he'd seen before. His heart started pounding again. "You see it too," he muttered. The mare snorted softly and stepped in front of the foal, her muscles tightening. Cole's instincts sharpened. Years of patrols and ambushes came flooding back. That dust wasn't from a storm, it moved too precisely. He squinted into the glare. Horses, maybe. Or vehicles. Whatever it was coming closer. He looked at the mare, at the way she watched the horizon. There was no fear in her stance, only alertness, as if she recognized what approached. Then, faintly, over the still air, came a new sound. Not hooves, engines. Cole's stomach tightened. "Oh no," he breathed. "Not hunters." He'd heard stories, illegal chasers, poachers targeting wild Mustangs to sell or capture for profit. If they saw this mare and her foal, he clenched his fists, helplessness burning through him. The engines grew louder. The mare stamped her hoof once, agitated. The foal pressed against her side. Cole knew he had to make a decision, stay hidden, and risk them being caught, or somehow draw the attention away. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his leg. "Damn it," he hissed. The vehicles crested the distant ridge, 3 off-road quads, their riders dressed in dust-covered gear. The roar of the engines shattered the fragile calm. The mare turned sharply, positioning herself between Cole and the noise. The foal trembled, but didn't run. Cole's mind raced. No weapon, no signal flare, no way to fight. But maybe... He reached for a nearby stone and hurled it as far as his weak arm allowed. It clattered loudly against the rocks, echoing through the canyon. The riders slowed. One pointed in his direction. Cole's pulse spiked. No, no, no. The mare stepped back, nostrils flaring, then let out a piercing cry, a sound that split the air like a trumpet of defiance. The foal mimicked her, smaller but sharp. The sound bounced between the cliffs. The riders turned toward the noise. For a tense few seconds, it seemed they might advance. Then the lead rider gestured to the others, shaking his head. Their engines revved again, and they veered away, heading north instead. The echo of their departure faded slowly. Silence returned. Cole slumped back, dizzy with relief. "You scared them off," he murmured to the mare. "You actually scared them off." The mare exhaled through her nose, eyes still locked on the horizon. The foal rubbed its head against her chest, trembling until it calmed. For a moment, the world felt sacred again. 3 souls alone in the vastness, bound by survival and something deeper, something that defied reason. As night approached, Cole built a crude shelter from branches and stones. The mare grazed nearby, while the foal followed him with innocent fascination. Each time he stumbled, it pressed close, steadying him in its own small way. He laughed once, quietly. "You're not supposed to be this smart, kid." By twilight, the heat of the day had vanished, replaced by a chill that bit through his torn clothes. The mare lay down again, curling near his side. The foal tucked itself between them. Cole hesitated only a moment before resting his hand gently on the foal's neck. Warmth, steady breathing, life. He closed his eyes, whispering to the night, "You two have more heart than most people I've known." Sleep took him fast and deep. He dreamt not of gunfire or loss, but of a herd running beneath starlight, their hooves striking sparks across the sand. He saw the white mare at the lead, the foal beside her, and behind them, himself. Whole again, running free. When he woke, dawn was breaking for the second time. The stream shimmered under soft light, and the air was cool with promise. He took stock of his injuries the splint had held, though the pain was fierce. He'd live, at least another day. But something was different. The mare stood further away this time, her head lifted high, ears pointed toward the west. The foal lingered near her, restless, shifting its weight from hoof to hoof. Cole sensed change in the air, a pressure, like the desert holding its breath. "What is it?" he whispered. The mare turned her head toward him. Their eyes met. Then she neighed sharply and started moving steady, purposeful. The foal hesitated, then trotted after her. "No," Cole said softly. "Don't go." They climbed the rise, the sun outlining their shapes in blinding gold. The mare paused at the top, silhouetted against the sky, and looked back one last time. The foal stopped too, ears flicking toward him. Cole felt his throat tighten. "Thank you," he said, voice cracking, "for not leaving me alone." The mare snorted once soft, almost gentle, and then she was gone, disappearing over the ridge with the foal close behind. The silence that followed was unbearable. Cole sat there for a long time, staring at the horizon. Without them, the desert suddenly felt enormous again, indifferent and empty. He told himself they'd done their part, that it was time for him to do his. He needed to find a way back, find help, make it out alive. He started to gather what little he had left his broken pack, his makeshift cane, the thin strip of water that would have to last. Each movement sent daggers of pain through his body, but he kept going. As he turned to face the ridge, something caught his eye. In the sand near where the mare had stood lay a single white hair long, gleaming like silver thread. He reached for it, rolling it between his fingers. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Cole tucked it carefully into his pocket, as though it were a medal. He limped toward the west, following faint hoofprints, half buried in dust, unsure where they led, but certain they meant something. The desert stretched before him, endless and burning and far in the distance, barely visible through the shimmering air. A column of dust began to rise again. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was moving fast, deliberate, toward him. Cole shaded his eyes, heart quickening. "What the hell now?" he muttered. The faint shape of riders, 3 of them emerged through the heat haze, sunlight glinting off something metallic on their arms. Badges. He could hear engines now, real ones, not poachers. For the first time in days, hope flickered like a flame. He raised his hand weakly, waving it toward the sky. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Hey, over here!" The mare and her foal were gone. But maybe, just maybe, they'd led him exactly where he needed to be. The riders slowed, then turned directly toward him. Relief washed through him like cool water, until he noticed something strange. The mare and foal had returned. They stood on a ridge above, perfectly still, watching. The mare's mane lifted in the wind. The foal stamped once, eyes locked on him. Cole's heart stopped. The lead rider lifted binoculars. "What the? There's horses up there," he said. Cole turned toward them, but in that instant, the mare reared, kicking up dust, and let out a cry that echoed across the desert. The sound rolled through the air like thunder. And then, somewhere behind the riders, another sound answered deeper, mechanical like rotor blades slicing the sky. Cole's breath caught. A helicopter. Was it rescue, or something else entirely? The world came alive in a storm of sound rotor blades chopping the air, engines rumbling across the desert floor. Cole Brennan squinted against the rising dust, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. The riders had stopped their ATVs, staring up at the approaching helicopter as it swept low over the dunes. He could barely lift his arm, but he waved anyway, desperate. "Here!" he shouted, his voice raw and cracking. "Over here!" The wind from the rotors whipped sand into his face, stinging like needles. The riders shielded their eyes, but when the chopper banked left, sunlight caught the insignia painted on its side. BLM, Bureau of Land Management. Relief hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't hallucinating. It wasn't hunters or traffickers. It was help. The white mare and her foal still stood on the ridge above him, unmoving. The foal's mane whipped wildly in the downwash, but they didn't flee. They simply watched. Silent sentinels of something bigger than survival. As the helicopter descended, Cole fell backward, exhausted. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard muffled voices and saw silhouettes approaching. "Jesus Christ!" one of them shouted over the noise. "He's alive!" Hands reached for him, gloved, careful, professional. The blur of uniforms came into focus. Tan shirts, sun-faded patches, ranger hats. A woman knelt beside him, her hair tied back in a tight braid streaked with silver. Her face was tanned, lined by years in the desert, but her eyes were steady and kind. "Easy," she said. "You're safe now." He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. She pressed a water bottle to his lips, tilting it gently. Small sips, cold water hit his tongue, and he nearly cried from the relief. "I'm Ranger Maria Torres," she said. "You fell from the ridge?" Cole nodded weakly. "Cliff, legs broken. Been here 2 days." Maria's team moved efficiently, checking his pulse, cleaning wounds, stabilizing the splint he'd made. One ranger, a tall man with a dust-covered beard, whistled low. He did a decent job on the leg. Damn good for field work. Cole tried to lift his head, looking toward the ridge. "The horses," he croaked. "They stayed with me. The mare white one and her foal. They saved my life." Maria followed his gaze. For a moment, her expression softened with awe. "That's impossible," she murmured. "Aurora?" The name caught him off guard. "You know her?" Maria smiled faintly. "We've been tracking a white mare and her foal for 3 days. They separated from their herd. We call her Aurora, the foal Halo." "Fitting," Cole said, his voice trembling. "They found me after I fell, slept next to me all night, led me to water." Maria's eyes widened slightly, disbelief flickering there, but only for a second. She glanced toward her team. "Blake, call it in. Tell the pilot we've got 1 survivor, critical but stable. Prep for evac." The helicopter flared dust again as the Rangers worked quickly, securing Cole onto a stretcher. When they lifted him, he hissed through his teeth, pain flashing white behind his eyes. Maria's voice cut through the chaos, steady and calm. "Hang on, Marine, we've got you." The title hit something deep inside him, old pride, buried under years of silence. "How'd you—" "Dog tags," she said, nodding toward the chain around his neck. Cole forced a weak smile. "Guess I forgot to take those off." Maria grinned back. "Most Marines never do." As they carried him toward the helicopter, he turned his head for one last look at the ridge. Aurora and Halo were still there. The mare stood like a statue, mane rippling in the downdraft. The foal stamped once, tossing its head, eyes locked on him. Cole raised his hand weakly. The foal whinnied a high, clear sound that cut through the roar of the rotor blades. Then they turned and galloped into the desert, vanishing behind a curtain of dust. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the shimmer of their white coats dissolving into sunlight. When he woke again, the world was clean, bright, and sterile. The rhythmic beep of monitors replaced the howl of wind. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air. He was alive. A nurse appeared beside his bed. "Mr. Brennan, you're at Desert Springs Medical in Las Vegas. You've been through quite an ordeal." Cole blinked at the ceiling. The memory came in fragments: the fall, the pain, the warmth of the mare against his body. "How long?" "3 days," she said gently. "You were dehydrated, concussed, broken tibia, multiple fractures, but you're healing." He nodded, the words barely registering. 3 days. That meant Aurora and Halo had been alone again all this time. The nurse smiled. "You've got a visitor." Maria Torres stepped into the room, hat in hand. She looked less like a ranger now, and more like someone who had seen miracles and was still trying to make sense of them. "Maureen Brennan," she greeted. "Glad to see you conscious." Cole chuckled weakly. "Glad to be conscious." She took a seat beside his bed. "We found your truck at the trailhead, by the way. Good thing you signed the permit with your sister's number. We called her. She's flying in tonight." "Sarah," Cole said, smiling faintly. "She never lets me disappear too long." Maria studied him for a moment, then asked quietly, "What you said back there about the horses, you're sure you weren't hallucinating?" Cole looked her dead in the eyes. "I've hallucinated before. This wasn't that. They saved me." Maria leaned back, crossing her arms thoughtfully. "I believe you, and you should know you're not the only one who's seen strange behavior from that mare. Aurora's been different ever since she foaled, more protective, more deliberate." Cole frowned. "Deliberate? She seems to choose her movements," Maria explained. "We've seen her lead the herd away from danger before, but never toward a human, until you." He swallowed hard. "Then maybe she knew." Maria tilted her head. "Knew what?" "That I needed saving." Later that evening, as the city outside hummed with neon life, Maria returned with a tablet in her hand. "You might want to see this," she said, setting it on the tray beside his bed. The screen showed footage from her ranger team's body cameras, the rescue, the descent, and beyond. In the corner of one frame, as the chopper lifted off, Aurora and Halo were visible atop the ridge. Maria paused the video, zooming in. "You see that?" she asked. Cole nodded slowly. They stayed to watch. "Exactly. Every other wild horse we've encountered bolts at the sound of a helicopter. But not her. Not them." Cole couldn't look away. There was something ancient, almost sentient, in Aurora's posture. "Can I get a copy of that?" he asked quietly. Maria smiled. "Already sent it to your email." He laughed softly. "You know, most people would call that a miracle." She met his gaze. "Most people would. But I think maybe it's a message." Cole raised an eyebrow. "From who?" Maria stood, putting her hat back on. "Maybe from the wild itself." 2 days later, his sister Sarah arrived, a whirlwind of concern, sarcasm, and fierce love. She scolded him first, hugged him second, and cried third. "You always have to find trouble, don't you?" she said, wiping her eyes. "Guess I'm consistent," he joked. Maria visited one more time before heading back to the Mojave. "When you're healed," she told him, "you should come visit the field station. We're studying Aurora's herd. Something's different about them." Cole hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." Maria extended her hand. "Then it's settled. Take care, Maureen." He shook it, her grip firm and warm. As she turned to go, he asked, "Do you think they'll remember me?" Maria smiled over her shoulder. "With horses like that, I'd bet on it." Weeks passed, his bones mended, the nightmares that had haunted him since the war softened around the edges. He spent hours watching the video Maria had given him, the moment where Aurora stood unmoving while the helicopter lifted off. There was something in her eyes, even from that distance, a knowing, a patience that unsettled him. By the 6th week, he was walking with a cane. The doctors called it a miracle recovery. He didn't argue. When Maria's email arrived, the subject line read, "Aurora's band, tracking update." He opened it. Inside were coordinates, photos of the herd grazing along the eastern ridge, and one note from Maria. "They've reunited with their band. The foal's growing fast. We're setting up a research station nearby if you want to visit." Cole stared at the screen for a long time. The desert had nearly taken his life, yet something in it called him back. That night, standing on his balcony overlooking the city lights, he made his decision. The next morning, the Mojave stretched before him once again, endless, golden, alive. The government field truck rumbled down the dirt road, and Maria's familiar voice crackled through the radio. "Welcome back to the desert, Brennan. You ready for round 2? He smiled, the first genuine smile in years. Yeah, he said. Let's find them. They drove until the road became nothing more than tire marks in the dust. Ahead, the sun was setting behind red cliffs. Maria stopped the truck. This is it, Eastern Ridge. Cole stepped out, his boots sinking into the warm sand. The air smelled of creosote and wind. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whinny echoed. He froze. Maria glanced at him. You hear that? He nodded slowly. She's here. The sound came again, soft, melodic, unmistakable. They climbed the rise, the last light of day bathing the land in molten gold. And there, against the horizon, stood a familiar silhouette, Aurora. Her mane shimmered in the dying sun, and beside her, Halo, taller now, stronger. Cole's throat tightened. He took a cautious step forward. Maria held out a hand. Easy, don't spook them. He stopped, watching as Aurora turned her head toward him. The distance between them was maybe 100 yards, but her gaze locked onto him as though no time had passed. The foal, no, not a foal anymore, took a few steps closer, ears pricked. Cole whispered, You remember me, don't you? Aurora lifted her head high, mane catching the wind. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded once. Maria exhaled, awed. Did you see that? Cole didn't answer. His heart was too full. Aurora turned, leading Halo back toward the herd. But before vanishing into the dunes, Halo stopped. The young horse pawed the ground 3 times, then looked back over its shoulder directly at Cole. He felt a chill run through him. Maria whispered, That's intentional. Cole nodded slowly. Yeah, it is. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert in shades of blue and silver. Cole stood motionless, the echo of hoofbeats fading into the night. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called, long and low. The air felt charged, alive, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Maria broke the silence. You think this is over? Cole watched the horizon where Aurora had vanished, his jaw tightening. No, he said quietly. I think this is just beginning. Far in the distance, a flash of light flickered near the horizon, artificial, steady, not from stars or campfires. Maria frowned. That's odd. No one should be out there tonight. Cole stared at it, unease prickling his skin. Then maybe someone's looking for them. The Mojave Desert had a way of testing what a man was made of. It stripped away everything unnecessary comfort, noise, ego, until only truth remained. For Cole Brennan, truth was all that was left. It had been 6 weeks since Aurora and Halo had saved his life. 6 weeks since the hospital lights, the white walls, the pitying smiles. He'd traded the hum of machines for the whisper of wind and sand once again, this time as part of the Bureau of Land Management's research team. Maria Torres had pulled strings to make it happen. You want purpose? She'd told him. Help us protect what saved you. Now, standing outside the Joshua Tree Field Station, Cole adjusted the strap of his gear bag and squinted at the horizon. The desert stretched before him in waves of red and gold. It was early autumn cooler, quieter, deceptively peaceful. Behind him, a woman's voice broke the silence. Beautiful, isn't it? He turned to see Dr. Evelyn Carter, mid-40s, sharp eyes softened by curiosity. She wore khaki field clothes dusted with sand, her dark hair tied back in a loose braid. Most people see empty wasteland, she continued. But you see something else. Cole smiled faintly. I see where I almost died. Evelyn returned the smile. And where you were reborn, maybe. They shared a quiet moment before she gestured toward the research vehicle. We've been tracking Aurora's herd near the Eastern Ridge. Maria says you've got a knack for finding them. I didn't find them, Cole said. They found me. Evelyn studied him a moment, as if weighing whether he was a scientist's ally or a mystic's echo. Well, she said, let's hope they're still interested in being found. The drive was long and rough. The desert rolled out endlessly, broken only by the scattered silhouettes of Joshua trees and the skeletons of old mines. Dust plumed behind the tires. Maria sat in the passenger seat, studying her GPS. We've tagged a few from the band with trackers. Aurora isn't one of them. She's too wary, but her herd's patterns are predictable. Grazing range about 20 miles north of the Salt Basin. Evelyn glanced back at Cole. We'll set up observation gear, get some distance footage. Try not to influence behavior. Understood, Cole said. But you should know they don't scare easy. Maria laughed. I remember. They arrived near dusk. The team set up camp beside a dry creek bed, its cracked earth shimmering in the fading light. Cole helped pitch tents, his movements slower now, measured. His leg had healed, but the stiffness reminded him of fragility, something he wasn't used to feeling. As night fell, the desert came alive with whispers, crickets, the mournful cry of a distant coyote, the soft shift of wind through sagebrush. Cole sat by the fire, staring into the flames. You ever think about how quiet it gets out here? He asked. Maria sipped from her canteen. Quiet's relative. Out here, silence has layers. Evelyn nodded, eyes reflecting the firelight. And sometimes, it listens back. Cole smiled. You sound like my grandfather. He used to say horses could hear what people refused to admit. Maybe he was right, Evelyn said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thought. Then, far off, a faint sound drifted through the night, air soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Hooves. Maria's head snapped up. Did you hear that? Cole was already standing, scanning the horizon. The moonlight caught movement, a shimmer of pale white against the dark dunes. Aurora. She was smaller in the distance than he remembered, but unmistakable. The full halo moved at her side, its stride stronger now. Evelyn whispered, My God, they came to us. The mare stopped about 50 yards away, head lifted high, watching them. Her ears flicked, nostrils flaring. She looked like something sculpted from starlight. Cole stepped forward, slowly, carefully. Hey there, he said, voice steady. Remember me? Halo pranced, torn between curiosity and caution. The mare remained still, unflinching. Cole took another step, then stopped. The wind shifted. Aurora's ears twitched, and for a heartbeat, he felt it again, the unspoken recognition, that silent bridge between species. Evelyn raised her camera, capturing every detail. This is extraordinary, she murmured. Then, without warning, Aurora turned sharply and trotted away, halo following close. Cole's chest tightened. Wait. Maria put a hand on his shoulder. She's leading you. Watch. Sure enough, Aurora stopped at the ridge, looking back once before disappearing over the crest. Cole stared after her, heart pounding. She wants us to follow. Evelyn frowned. Or, she's warning us away. But Cole already knew. The same instinct that had guided him to water weeks ago burned in his gut again. I'm going. Maria sighed. Figures. Marines never take orders from anyone but their gut. Stay close, Evelyn said. If this is what I think it is, we'll want the footage. They followed the faint trail under the moonlight. The desert was a world of silver now, shadows stretching like ghosts across the sand. The air carried a strange stillness, not peaceful, but watchful. Aurora's hoofprints were easy to track, her path deliberate. After nearly half an hour, they reached a narrow canyon, half collapsed from erosion. Cole raised his flashlight. You sure this is safe? Maria grinned. Out here? Never. They moved forward, the beam slicing through darkness. The smell of old dust and mineral seep filled the air. Then Cole froze. You hear that? A faint metallic clatter echoed ahead. Not natural, Evelyn whispered. Could be wildlife. Cole shook his head. That's human. They advanced cautiously. The passage widened into a small hollow carved by time and flash floods. There, half buried in sand, was something unmistakably out of place, a portable water trough, overturned and cracked, its metal sides stamped with faded government markings. Maria crouched beside it, brushing off dust. BLM property, issued last season. Someone's been here. Cole scanned the area. Maybe they left it. Or didn't want it found, Maria said grimly. Nearby, Evelyn found tire tracks leading deeper into the canyon, fresher than they should have been. These aren't ranger vehicles, she said. Patterns off. Tread looks like quads or ATVs. Cole's stomach tightened. The same kind that chased Aurora before. Maria exhaled sharply. Illegal chasers. Evelyn's face hardened. If they're back in this range, Aurora's herd could be at risk. Cole knelt, touching one of the tracks. The sand was still slightly warm. They were here not long ago. The realization hit them all at once. Aurora hadn't just appeared, she'd led them here. She was showing us this, Cole said, trying to warn us. Evelyn stared at him. You really think she knew? He looked back at her, unwavering. She's known more than any of us since day one. Maria's radio crackled suddenly, making them all flinch. Station 1, this is Ranger Dawson, came a voice. We picked up heat signatures north of your location, multiple moving fast. Might be poachers. Maria's jaw tightened. Copy that. We're in a canyon about 2 clicks south. We'll check it out. She turned to Cole. Looks like you were right. Cole looked up toward the ridge where Aurora had vanished. She's trying to keep them safe. Then we better help her do it, Maria said. By dawn, the team was back at camp, exhausted but determined. Evelyn uploaded the footage from the night. On her laptop screen, Aurora's silhouette stood framed by moonlight, the mare turning her head toward the canyon before leading them away. It's like she wanted us to see, Evelyn murmured. Maria rubbed her temples. We need to file this with headquarters immediately. If poachers are back, We'll need aerial surveillance. Cole leaned against the jeep, silent. The morning sun painted the world in copper tones, but his mind was already somewhere else. He thought about that night weeks ago, the way Aurora had stood guard over him, the way Halo had nudged his hand, leading him to life. It wasn't coincidence. It never had been. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you told me horses, remember?" "Yes," she replied. "Faces, voices, gestures, even emotions. Then they remember fear too," he said, "and trust." She nodded. "Exactly." Cole met her gaze. "Then I think Aurora's trying to trust us. She's asking for help." Evelyn stared at him for a long time, the scientist in her warring with the believer. Finally, she said, "Then we give it." That evening, the desert glowed under a blood-orange sunset. The air carried the faint scent of ozone storm coming from the south. Maria radioed in the day's report. Evelyn prepped equipment for the next day's survey. Cole sat a short distance from camp, notebook in hand, sketching the curve of the ridge and the canyon below. He paused mid-line, staring at something glinting near the horizon. It was subtle, just a flicker of light, a reflection. He raised his binoculars. 2 black vehicles, parked where the desert road ended. No markings. He could just make out figures moving around them, setting up something metallic tripods, maybe cameras, or scopes. Cole's pulse quickened. "Maria," he called quietly, "you need to see this." She joined him, squinting through the binoculars. Her expression darkened. "That's not our crew." Evelyn approached, worry etching her face. "Who are they?" Maria lowered the binoculars. "If I had to guess, private contractors, not the kind that follow wildlife ethics." Cole's jaw tightened. "They're after the herd." Maria exhaled, frustrated. "We can't confront them tonight. We need evidence, coordination." Evelyn crossed her arms. "And what happens if they move before sunrise?" Cole stared out at the fading light. "Then Aurora's in danger." A long silence followed, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Finally, Maria said, "We'll report it. At dawn, we follow them." Cole nodded, but his eyes stayed on that glinting horizon long after the others turned away. The vehicles hadn't moved, but as the sun vanished completely, one of the figures looked up toward him. Even from this distance, he could feel it. The awareness, the unspoken challenge. He stepped back instinctively, the old soldier in him stirring awake. Evelyn noticed. "What's wrong?" Cole didn't answer at first. His pulse was steady now, cold, focused. "Someone out there just saw us," he said finally. Maria turned sharply. "You sure?" He nodded. "Yeah, and they didn't look surprised." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint metallic whir of a drone somewhere overhead. Cole's eyes lifted toward the darkening sky. And there it was, a small red light blinking against the dusk, circling above their camp like a watchful eye. Evelyn whispered, "That's not ours." The drone paused mid-air, then banked sharply and flew toward the north, straight in the direction of Aurora's herd. Cole's heart dropped. They've already started. The morning came hard and fast, the kind of desert dawn that bleeds from black to gold in a matter of minutes. Cole Brennan hadn't slept. None of them had. The whine of that drone still haunted his ears, the red light circling their camp like a silent warning before vanishing into the night. Now, as the first rays broke across the Mojave, he stood beside the jeep, scanning the horizon through binoculars. The air was sharp, cool, deceptive. Nothing moved, but the desert never stayed empty for long. Maria Torres poured coffee from the thermos, her jaw set tight. "I've sent footage to headquarters," she said. "They'll review it, but bureaucracy moves slower than a snake in winter. We're on our own for now." Dr. Evelyn Carter adjusted her laptop on the hood of the jeep. "If those aren't official contractors, then someone's funding them. Equipment like that doesn't come cheap. Whoever they are, they're organized." Cole lowered the binoculars. "Organized enough to use drones. They're tracking her." "Her?" Maria asked. "Aurora," he said quietly, "and the herd." The wind shifted then, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and dust, a storm of human making. Cole didn't need to see it to know they were close. Evelyn checked her GPS tablet. 2 trackers from Aurora's band are still active east of the basin. If we move fast, we can intercept before anyone else reaches them. Maria nodded. "Then we move now. Grab what you can carry. No second chances out here." Cole's cane leaned unused against the jeep. He slung his pack over his shoulder, grimacing as old pain flared in his leg. The desert had broken his bones once. It wouldn't stop him this time. The ride across the basin was brutal. The sun climbed higher, washing the world in white glare. Heat shimmered off the sand, bending the horizon into a living mirage. Maria drove like someone who knew every inch of the Mojave fast, fearless, efficient. Evelyn monitored the GPS, calling out coordinates while dust trailed behind them in long, ghostly ribbons. Cole stared out the window, remembering that first day the fall, the pain, the white mare standing over him like a guardian spirit. Now she was somewhere ahead, unaware of the danger closing in. When they reached higher ground, Maria slowed and parked behind a ridge. "This is as close as we can get without spooking them," she said. They climbed out, ducking low against the wind. Evelyn unfolded a drone controller, her fingers moving quickly. The small device lifted with a faint hum, vanishing into the bright sky. "Video feed online," she said. "Let's see what we've got." The screen flickered to life, vast stretches of desert, dotted with sparse vegetation. Then, movement. A cluster of horses, grazing near a shallow depression. Aurora's white coat was unmistakable, even from above, gleaming like sunlight caught in motion. Cole exhaled, relief mixing with awe. She's there. But the moment was short-lived. Evelyn zoomed out, and there, less than 2 miles to the south, dust plumes rose from another set of vehicles. Maria cursed under her breath. "They're closing in fast." Cole's jaw tightened. If they reach her first, they'll drive the herd toward the cliffs. Evelyn's fingers danced on the controls. "We've got one advantage: they don't know we're watching." Maria looked at Cole. "You know this terrain better than anyone. How do we get there first?" He studied the map spread on the hood of the Jeep. "There's a dry wash that cuts through the basin. If we stay low, we can come up behind the herd without being seen." Maria's eyes met his. "It's risky." Cole's voice hardened. "So is doing nothing." They moved fast, cutting the engines halfway through the wash to avoid detection. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots and the whisper of sand sliding underfoot. Above them, the drone buzzed faintly, sending back live images. Evelyn's voice stayed calm, clipped, professional. "They're half a mile out. They've got nets. Looks like a capture operation, not just observation." Cole stopped short. "They're taking them alive?" "Yeah," Maria said grimly. "To sell or relocate. Either way, it's death for the herd." Cole's heart hammered. Not today. They crested the final ridge, and there they were. Aurora's herd grazed peacefully in the shallow valley below, oblivious to the danger approaching from the south. But on the horizon, 4 black vehicles tore through the sand, engines roaring. Maria's radio crackled. "Station 1, this is Torres. Unauthorized roundup in progress requesting immediate backup." Static answered her. No signal. Evelyn swore under her breath. "They're jamming us." Cole looked down at Aurora. The mare lifted her head, ears twitching. She sensed it too, the low rumble of approaching chaos. Then the first ATV crested the far ridge, a man standing on the back with a net gun aimed forward. "Not on my watch," Maria muttered, raising her flare launcher. She fired. The red flare screamed into the sky, bursting like fire against the blue. The drivers hesitated, startled. Cole used the moment to grab a reflective blanket from the Jeep, waving it above his head. The light caught the sun, flashing across the valley. Aurora turned toward the signal instantly. "Come on," he whispered. "See me." The mare neighed sharply, her call echoing across the basin. The herd stirred, nervous. Then the engines revved again, louder. "Move!" Maria shouted. Aurora wheeled and bolted, the herd following in a rush of dust and thunder. Halo stayed tight at her flank, muscles flashing beneath golden light. The poachers gave chase, their engines screaming. Nets fired, missing by inches. The air filled with chaos, sand, shouting, the rhythmic drum of hooves. Cole ran, ignoring the pain in his leg. Every instinct from his military years kicked in focus, timing, movement. He reached the ridgeline, positioning himself between the chasers and the herd's escape route. He grabbed a smoke flare from Maria's pack and yanked the pin. Thick orange smoke poured out, swallowing the air. "Go!" he yelled. Aurora's herd thundered past, vanishing into the haze. For a moment, the desert belonged to the wild again. Then a gunshot cracked. Cole froze. Evelyn screamed, "Down!" A bullet struck the sand a few feet away, spraying grit across his face. Another ricocheted off the rocks. Maria dropped beside him, drawing her sidearm. "They're armed. These bastards mean business." Cole's pulse pounded in his ears. "We've got to get them out of here." Evelyn crawled toward the drone controller, voice shaking. "If I can get this footage out before they jam it completely, headquarters will have proof." "Do it," Maria said. "We'll cover you." Cole peeked over the ridge. The poachers were regrouping, shouting orders. One pointed straight at them. He felt the old soldier rising again, the part of him that once thrived under fire. "Maria," he said, "we can't hold this position long." She grinned despite the tension. Didn't plan to. Together, they tossed another flare downhill, masking their retreat in dense smoke. Evelyn's drone lifted off again, rising above the chaos, capturing every second the gunmen, the vehicles, the chase. When they finally reached the Jeep, Cole's lungs burned. The roar of engines grew distant, fading as the poachers veered east, still pursuing the herd. Maria slammed the door and started the engine. "We're not done yet." Evelyn's screen showed the feed still live. They're herding them toward Dead Horse Canyon. Cole's blood ran cold. He knew that place narrow, steep-sided, a trap for any animal that entered. "They'll be boxed in," he said. "Nowhere to go." Maria accelerated, tires biting into sand. "Then we beat them there." They drove hard, faster than the terrain should have allowed. The Jeep bounced violently over ruts and dry washes. Dust filled the cabin, coating their throats. Cole clung to the door handle, eyes fixed on the horizon. The canyon walls rose ahead like jagged knives. When they arrived, the sound of engines echoed through the ravine. Maria slammed on the brakes. "They're already inside." Cole jumped out before the vehicle even stopped. The air smelled of fuel and fear. Down below, Aurora and the herd were cornered, trapped between two rock faces. The poachers' vehicles formed a semicircle, cutting off every exit. Nets glinted in the sunlight. Cole's heart hammered. "We've got to do something." Maria drew her radio again, voice sharp. "Station 1, emergency at Dead Horse Canyon. Armed suspects, repeat, armed attempting illegal capture." Static again. Then Evelyn's drone feed crackled. The signal was weak but still transmitting. "It's recording everything," she said breathlessly. "They can't stop this now." One of the poachers fired a shot into the air, driving the horses into panic. Aurora reared, kicking wildly. Halo pressed against her side, trembling. Cole moved without thinking. He grabbed another flare, yanked the pin, and hurled it straight into the canyon. It burst into a cloud of red smoke, confusing both horses and humans alike. The herd surged forward, breaking through a narrow opening between the rocks. The poachers scrambled, shouting curses. "Go, go, go!" Maria shouted, covering Cole as he limped back toward the Jeep. They sped away just as the first of the poachers' vehicles gave chase. "Hold on!" Maria yelled, swerving through the canyon mouth. Bullets pinged off the rocks behind them, sparks flying. Cole ducked low, gripping the seat. The world became a blur of noise and motion. Finally, after what felt like forever, the gunfire faded. The poachers didn't follow. Evelyn checked her screen signal restored. "We've got it all. The chase, the shots, the herd, everything. It's already uploading to BLM servers." Maria exhaled, slamming the steering wheel once. "Then they're finished." Cole leaned back, drenched in sweat. "So, is Aurora?" Evelyn looked out the window toward the open desert. "If they made it out, they'll head for the high ridge. But we won't know until morning." Cole's hand tightened around the white hair he still carried in his pocket. "She's smarter than they are. She'll survive." Maria looked over at him. "You sound like you know her better than most people." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." The wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound, distant, high-pitched, wild. A horse's call. Cole's heart leapt. She's alive. They stopped the Jeep, stepping out into the cool desert twilight. The sound came again, echoing through the canyon, 3 short cries, evenly spaced. Maria frowned. "You think that's random?" Cole shook his head. "No, that's her pattern. 3 times. It's a signal." Evelyn whispered. "Then what's she saying?" Cole looked out into the darkening expanse, where shadows gathered like secrets waiting to be found. "She's telling us it's not over," he said softly. And then, faint and mechanical, another sound cut through the wind, a low hum of rotor blades approaching fast from the north. Maria's eyes widened. "That's not ours." Cole turned toward the sound, the desert wind whipping against his face. Whatever was coming, it wasn't rescue. The night swallowed the desert whole. Only the sound of rotor blades carved through the darkness, distant but growing louder. Cole Brennan stood frozen, the wind whipping grit into his eyes. The helicopter's red running light flickered across the horizon like a pulse of danger. Maria Torres grabbed the radio, shouting above the wind, "Station 1, confirm aircraft inbound, do you copy?" Static. Nothing but static. Evelyn Carter clutched her laptop tight against her chest. "That's not a BLM chopper," she said, her voice steady but low. "No markings, no flight ID. Whoever those men were, they've got air support now." Cole's jaw clenched. "Then they're not poachers. They're professionals." The helicopter drew closer, its searchlight sweeping across the dunes like a blade of white fire. Cole instinctively pulled Maria and Evelyn behind the Jeep. The beam sliced across the canyon wall, then hovered for a moment right over the tracks where Aurora's herd had fled. "They're tracking her," he said, voice taut. Evelyn's eyes widened. "But how would they know her position? There's no tag on her." Unless someone else put one there, Maria muttered. A micro-transmitter, maybe something injected during one of those fake rescue operations. Cole's pulse quickened. Then they're not just trying to capture wild horses, they're studying them. Evelyn frowned. Studying? He looked at her. Or testing. The helicopter banked sharply, vanishing beyond the ridge. Silence returned, thick and uneasy. Maria exhaled. All right, we regroup at the station, compile footage, and hand this over to the feds. We've got enough to blow this open. Cole's voice was low, firm. Not yet. We need proof that can't be denied. Evelyn turned toward him. And what exactly would that be? He looked out at the darkness, the memory of Aurora's eyes still burning behind his own. We find her. We show them what she can do. By dawn, they were back at the Joshua Tree Field Station. The place buzzed with activity technicians reviewing drone footage, agents on calls, computers flickering with data streams. Maria had called in every favor she could, and now the room smelled of adrenaline and caffeine. Cole sat at the center table, staring at the frozen video frame on the monitor. Aurora, standing against the dust storm, looking straight into the drone's camera. There was intelligence there, an awareness that defied every definition of instinct. Evelyn paced nearby, her voice sharp from lack of sleep. You're suggesting we demonstrate cross-species recognition in front of a federal investigator? That's not proof, Cole. That's a gamble. He didn't look up. Maybe. But if the world sees what I saw, they won't be able to write it off as coincidence. Maria set down a folder on the table. Good news and bad news, she said. Good. The footage from the canyon uploaded successfully. It's under federal review as we speak. Bad. Paige Anderson, regional director, is flying in this morning to assess operational integrity. Translation: they think we botched protocol. Evelyn groaned. Perfect. Just what we need. Maria grinned wryly. You wanted attention, didn't you? Cole finally looked up. Let her come. She needs to see it herself. 2 hours later, a black SUV rolled through the gate, kicking up dust. Paige Anderson stepped out, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the composure of someone who'd spent decades in command rooms, not field stations. Her badge caught the Sunday. Ranger Torres, she said, shaking Maria's hand. Dr. Carter, and you must be Mr. Brennan, the Marine who claims divine intervention by a Mustang? Cole smiled faintly. Something like that. Paige's expression didn't change. I've read your report. Fascinating, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Evelyn gestured toward the screens. We have it. Behavior patterns, flight data, body cam recordings. Paige held up a hand. Data is good, Doctor, but public scrutiny is brutal. If this story leaks before it's verified, it'll be dismissed as folklore. Cole met her gaze. Then let's verify it. You want proof? Come see for yourself. Paige arched an eyebrow. And how do you propose that? Field demonstration, Maria said, cutting in. Aurora recognizes Brennan. She's shown specific, repeated responses, patterned signals. We can replicate them. Paige folded her arms. You're talking about teaching a horse to testify. Cole's tone was calm but certain. No, ma'am, I'm talking about letting her speak in her own way. That afternoon, the desert became their stage. The sun hovered high, washing the land in blinding light. The research team stood ready near the ridge drones overhead, cameras rolling, microphones embedded in the sand. Paige watched from beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her expression unreadable. If this goes wrong, she said, it'll be the end of your project. Evelyn's voice was steady. If it goes right, it'll change how we define communication between species. Cole adjusted his stance, his legs still stiff but steady. He scanned the horizon. She'll come, he murmured. She always does. Minutes passed. The air shimmered. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. Then a flicker of movement. A white shape emerged through the mirage, slow and graceful. Aurora. Her mane rippled like silk in the heat. Halo trotted beside her, taller now, its coat gleaming like pale bronze. The herd stopped 100 yards away, cautious but curious. Paige whispered, That's her? Cole nodded. That's her. He stepped forward, hands open. The desert fell silent, every eye fixed on what would happen next. Aurora's ears pricked forward. She took one step, then another, sand whispering beneath her hooves. Halo followed, snorting softly. Cole spoke quietly, the same tone he'd used when they'd first met. You remember me, don't you? Aurora's gaze locked on him. She let out a low, throaty sound, half sigh, half hum. Paige frowned. Coincidence? Watch, Cole said. He lifted his right hand slowly, palm outward, the same gesture he'd made when the flare smoke had cleared weeks ago. Aurora froze, nostrils flaring. Then she stepped closer 3 deliberate strides and stopped just short of him. Halo approached next, lowering its head to touch his hand. Evelyn's breath caught. She's mirroring him. Aurora shifted her weight, pawed the sand once, twice, 3 times. The same signal she'd used before. Paige leaned forward. That's learned behavior. Cole shook his head. No, it's memory. For a long, electrified moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, Aurora lowered her head and pressed her muzzle gently against his shoulder. The cameras clicked. The drones hummed. Nobody spoke. Maria finally whispered, "You seeing this, Director?" Paige's face softened not with belief yet, but with doubt in her own disbelief. "I'm seeing something," she said quietly. Aurora exhaled, her warm breath brushing against Cole's neck. Then she turned, touching Halo's nose with hers before stepping back. Cole felt tears sting his eyes. "She's telling me it's okay." Paige looked away, blinking against the glare. "We'll review the footage. If it holds up, we might have something unprecedented." Evelyn's smile was faint but triumphant. The world's not ready for this, but it's time they learned. By evening, the station buzzed again, calls to D, C, data uploads, live analysis. The footage spread fast through internal channels. Words like sentient interaction and cross-species empathy appeared in preliminary reports. Paige pulled Cole aside. "You've made believers out of skeptics," she said, "but tread carefully. Not everyone wants this kind of proof to exist." He studied her face. "Meaning?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There are people who profit from keeping the wild voiceless." Cole's stomach tightened. "You mean the same ones funding those fake contractors?" She didn't confirm, but she didn't deny. "Just stay alert, and if you see that helicopter again, you call me first." Cole nodded, though a cold certainty settled in his chest. That night, the desert seemed almost peaceful again. The team camped outside instead of sleeping in bunks, their equipment humming softly under the stars. Evelyn sat beside Cole near the fire, the glow painting her face gold. "You realize," she said, "if this footage holds, Aurora might become the most studied animal in America." He nodded. "And the most hunted." She looked at him. "You think they'll come back?" He stared into the fire. "They always come back for what they can't control." The flames crackled. Somewhere out in the darkness, a single horse neighed a low, mournful sound that drifted across the plain. Cole stood, scanning the horizon. "That's not random," he said softly. Maria looked up from her logbook. "Aurora?" He nodded slowly. "She's calling again." Evelyn frowned. "But for what?" Cole listened carefully, his pulse quickening. The cry came again, 3 short calls, followed by silence. He turned toward the north, eyes narrowing. "She's warning us." Evelyn stood beside him. "About what?" Before he could answer, a flash lit up the horizon, brief, sharp, unnatural. Not lightning. Not a flare. Maria's radio hissed to life, the voice on the other end urgent. "Station 1, this is Field Unit Delta. Unidentified activity detected 5 miles north of your location. Multiple heat signatures. Possibly aircraft on the ground." Evelyn's breath caught. "Aircraft? At night?" Cole's gaze stayed fixed on the dark ridge where the light had flashed. "Yeah," he said quietly, "and I think I know exactly who's flying them." The wind shifted, carrying the faint, familiar whine of a drone. Then, from the direction of the ridge, a beam of white light snapped on, searching, sweeping, cutting across the night straight toward them. The first light of dawn painted the Mojave in tones of rust and gold. Wind stirred the dry grass near the ridge, carrying with it a tension that felt almost electric. Cole Brennan stood beside the field jeep, his eyes locked on the horizon. Somewhere out there, past the jagged silhouettes of the canyon walls, Aurora's herd moved unseen. Behind him, the camp buzzed like a hive. Drones were being calibrated, data stations powered on, lenses cleaned. Ranger Maria Torres moved between tents, barking short, efficient orders. Evelyn Carter paced near the main table, her tablet glowing pale blue against the dim morning light. Today wasn't another research session. Today was proof day. The Bureau of Land Management had authorized a public demonstration, one final evaluation, before deciding whether Aurora's herd would be permanently protected or captured in the next federal roundup. Cameras would stream live to D, C, and observers from the Department of the Interior were already en route by helicopter. Cole flexed his hands to still the tremor that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with memory. "Feels like a mission," he muttered. Maria glanced up. "You always talk to yourself before battle?" He smiled faintly. "Only when I'm outnumbered." Evelyn approached, sliding her sunglasses into place. "We've set up at the North Meadow. Best visibility, minimal wind interference. If they come, the behavior will be clear on every drone feed." "If they come," Cole repeated softly. Maria caught the edge in his tone. They will. She trusts you. That hasn't changed. Cole looked toward the ridge, where sunlight began spilling over the rock. Trust works both ways. By mid-morning, the staging area was ready. The equipment was a strange mix of military precision and wild country improvisation tripods dug into the sand, cables running toward solar-powered rigs, and a single folding chair set 50 yards from the main hub. That's your spot, Evelyn said, pointing toward it. Same posture as before, hands visible, no sudden movements. Cole nodded. The air was already hot enough to shimmer, but he didn't mind. He'd trained in worse conditions. What rattled him wasn't the heat, it was the crowd. Paige Anderson had arrived in a second SUV, joined by 2 federal observers and a live broadcast technician. She looked as unflappable as ever, hair pinned neatly under her hat, clipboard in hand. This entire feed is being transmitted to our central office, she told Evelyn. Audio, visual, telemetry. Any irregularity, any hint of animal distress will shut it down. Evelyn met her gaze evenly. Then we'll make sure there isn't any. Paige gave a short nod, then turned to Cole. Sergeant Brennan, you understand you are not to initiate physical contact unless the animal approaches first. Yes, ma'am. Good. The department wants evidence, not sentiment. Cole allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. Sometimes those are the same thing. The demonstration began just after 10 a.m. Drone feeds flickered to life, showing the sweeping curves of the desert. The horizon trembled with heat. Everyone waited. Minutes passed. Then a movement barely visible at first caught the edge of one drone's camera. Contact, Ben Liu's voice came through the headset. North quadrant, 200 yards and closing. Evelyn leaned forward. Visual confirm? Confirmed, Ben replied. Multiple shapes. Leading mare is white. Cole rose slowly from the chair. The air seemed to still around him. From across the meadow, Aurora appeared. Her coat gleamed under the sun like liquid pearl, her mane wind-tossed and alive. Halo followed, grown taller and stronger now, the desert's wildfire burning behind his eyes. The rest of the herd lingered behind them, watchful, uncertain. Cole felt his throat tighten. Easy, girl, he whispered, though the wind stole his words. Aurora's ears flicked forward. She took a step toward him, then another. Maria whispered into her radio, all units hold position, do not interfere. The observers murmured behind Paige, the kind of low, skeptical commentary scientists make when they don't yet believe what they're seeing. Cole knelt in the sand, hands open, every movement deliberate. Aurora stopped 30 feet away, nostrils flaring. Halo paced around her legs, tail flicking, restless. The herd behind them stirred. Cole spoke quietly, his voice breaking the stillness. You remember this place. You remember me. Aurora tossed her head once. Then, just as she had done weeks before, she pawed the ground 3 times. A murmur rippled through the observers. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, she refused to blink away. It's not random, she whispered. She's repeating a signal. Cole felt his pulse in his throat. That's right, girl, you know me. He lifted his hand, the same slow gesture, palm outward. Halo stepped forward, curiosity overcoming caution. He approached within arm's reach, ears pricked, and for a long, breathless second, the world narrowed to that tiny space between human and horse. Then, Halo stretched his neck and touched his muzzle to Cole's hand. The reaction around the site was instant. Cameras zoomed. The federal observers leaned forward. Paige's lips parted, her usual composure slipping. Cole whispered, "Good boy," his voice trembling. Aurora whickered low, stepping closer. She lowered her massive head, pressing her muzzle briefly to his shoulder, the same gentle contact she had made in the canyon the night she'd saved him. Maria exhaled shakily. She's claiming him. Evelyn's voice cracked in her headset. Every sensor caught that, every single one. Paige spoke softly, almost to herself. It's deliberate, unmistakably deliberate. Cole smiled faintly, emotion flickering beneath his sunburned face. Now you see what I meant. For several heartbeats, no one spoke. The desert seemed to breathe with them. Then a sudden gust of wind swept through the valley, scattering dust across the cameras. Aurora snorted, turning her head sharply eastward. Halo tensed, muscles coiling. Evelyn frowned. What is it? Cole's eyes followed the mare's gaze. Far off, something glinted metal catching sunlight where no metal should be. Ben's voice came over the headset, sharp now. We've got movement on Drone 3, East Ridge, 2 vehicles inbound. Maria swore under her breath. Not scheduled. Paige grabbed the radio. Identify yourselves. This is a restricted demonstration zone. No response. The vehicles kept coming, twin trails of dust curling behind them. Cole stood quickly. Aurora neighed a sharp, warning cry, and the entire herd bolted into motion. Halo stayed one heartbeat longer, eyes fixed on Cole, before turning and running after his mother. The drones whirred to follow, but the wind tore through the feeds, static filling the airwaves. Paige shouted, "Pull the live stream, cut the feed now." Evelyn turned, panic flashing in her voice. "If we cut it, we lose visual evidence." Cole's instincts took over. "Keep it rolling," he barked. "If they're coming for the horses, we need proof of that too." The first truck crested the ridge, matte black, no markings. Men in tactical gear jumped out, carrying tranquilizer rifles. "Contractors," Maria hissed. "They're here for the herd." Paige's face went white. Who authorized this? But Cole wasn't listening. He was already running toward the ridge, his limp forgotten. "We're not letting them take her," Evelyn called after him. "Cole, wait." Sand flew beneath his boots. Every muscle screamed, but he didn't slow. The men on the ridge aimed, tranquilizer darts snapping through the air like hornets. Aurora and her herd veered, panic spreading through the formation. Cole shouted, "Don't you touch her!" He grabbed a flare from his belt, left over from the survival kits, and lit it, the red smoke billowing violently. The sudden color and movement startled the lead horse, forcing the shooters to adjust aim. Maria yelled into her radio, "Field Station 1, under attack, unauthorized personnel in federal zone." Cole reached the base of the ridge, just as a dart struck the ground inches from his feet. He threw the flare toward the attackers. It hissed and spun, filling the air with choking crimson smoke. Through the haze, he saw Aurora turn. Her eyes locked on him again, wide and terrified, but not running. She was waiting. Cole waved his arms, shouting through the smoke, "Go! Get them out!" Aurora stamped once, then whirled and galloped into the canyon, the rest of the herd following like a rolling storm of hooves. Evelyn's voice cracked over the radio. "They're getting away. We have them on drone feed." "Good," Cole panted. "Keep eyes on them. Don't lose them." He turned back toward the ridge, but the black trucks were gone, their engines fading into the distance, leaving only churned sand and silence. Paige arrived seconds later, breathless, fury cutting through her composure. "What the hell just happened here?" Cole looked at her, still catching his breath. "You tell me, Director, because those weren't poachers, and they knew exactly where to find us." Evelyn crouched beside a dart embedded in the sand, carefully lifting it with gloved hands. "Non-lethal, high-grade sedative," she murmured. "Government issue?" Paige's eyes narrowed. "You're saying these men were federal?" Cole wiped sweat and dust from his face. Or pretending to be. Either way, they had orders. Maria kicked the sand in frustration. "We need air support. If they have aircraft in the area..." Ben's voice broke through, urgent. "All drones offline. I repeat, every unit jammed." Evelyn froze. "That's impossible. The signal? Completely dead," Ben cut in. "Something's overriding our channel." Cole stared toward the horizon, the empty sky pulsing with heat. "They're not done," he said quietly. "They're covering their trail." Paige exhaled, steady but grim. "Then we'd better make sure we don't lose ours." Night fell heavy and cold. The research station was a hive of frantic activity backups, encrypted transfers, radio chatter between field agents. Every second mattered. Cole sat outside by the generator, the desert wind rough against his face. His hand still shook faintly, though he wasn't sure if it was adrenaline or fear. Evelyn approached, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You scared the hell out of me today." He took the cup with a faint smile. "Guess I've still got a few bad habits from the Marines." She sat beside him. "You realize what you did, right? You gave the herd a chance to escape. Without you, they'd be in holding pens right now." Cole looked out toward the dark ridge. They shouldn't have to run at all. Evelyn studied his profile, the hard lines softened by fatigue. "We'll get the footage out before anyone buries it." He nodded, though a shadow passed over his eyes. "You'd better hurry." "Why?" He tilted his head toward the canyon. In the distance, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of hoofbeats, steady, deliberate, drawing closer. Evelyn frowned. "That can't be them. It's the middle of the night." Cole rose slowly, every nerve alive. "No," he said. "That's not a herd running." He turned toward the sound, heart hammering. "It's a single horse." From the darkness beyond the ridge, a pale shape emerged, dust-coated, trembling. Aurora. She stopped at the edge of the camp, sides heaving, eyes wild. Cole took a step forward, disbelief etched across his face. "Aurora?" Evelyn whispered. "Where's Halo?" Aurora let out a low, broken cry, the kind of sound no animal should ever make. Cole's blood ran cold. He looked back toward the dark horizon, where the trucks had vanished hours before. Somewhere out there, a storm of engines rumbled again. The night tore open with the sound of hooves and engines. Aurora stood trembling at the edge of the research camp, her white coat streaked with dirt and blood. The floodlights threw her into stark relief, breath ragged, eyes wide with terror. Cole Brennan moved first. "Easy, girl," he whispered, stepping forward slowly. His hands shook, but his voice stayed steady, the same calm tone he'd used in the desert weeks ago when she'd saved his life. Aurora shifted her weight, half turning toward the darkness she'd come from, then back to him. Her body was tense, every muscle coiled like wire. "Where's Halo?" Evelyn's voice trembled. Aurora let out a low, shuddering cry, half scream, half sob. It wasn't an animal sound, it was anguish made flesh. Cole's stomach twisted. They took him. Maria Torres grabbed her radio. "Station 1 to field control, this is urgent. We have a wild mare returned alone. Possible abduction of remaining herd members. Requesting immediate search authorization." Static. No response. Ben Liu looked up from his laptop. "Communications are jammed again. Same frequency interference as earlier." Paige Anderson's face hardened. "They're still out there, and they're not done." Evelyn turned to Cole. "You said they'd come back for what they can't control. Well, they just did." Cole stared at Aurora. "Then we go after them." Maria blinked. "You're talking about tracking armed contractors in the dark through canyon country?" "Yes." Cole's voice left no room for argument. "They have a young horse, and we have the only lead that can find them." He turned to Aurora. "Show me where they took him." An hour later, the desert was alive again, this time with pursuit. The moon hung low and yellow, casting long shadows over the dry ridges. The team moved in 2 jeeps, headlights off, guided only by thermal scanners and Aurora herself, who trotted ahead like a ghost made of silver and dust. Cole rode in the lead vehicle beside Maria, scanning the terrain through night vision binoculars. Every so often, Aurora would stop, paw the ground, then veer in a new direction, as if following an invisible trail only she could sense. Evelyn's voice crackled through the headset. "Satellite feed confirms tire tracks heading north-northeast. 2 vehicles, possibly a third, matching the profile from earlier." Maria tightened her grip on the wheel. "That puts them near the dry basin by dawn." "Then that's where we end this," Cole said. They drove through the night, silence broken only by the hum of the engines and the steady rhythm of Aurora's hooves on hard ground. She never slowed, never hesitated. The bond between man and horse had become something beyond logic, something ancient, primal, unspoken. By the time dawn touched the horizon, the desert floor opened wide before them, flat, windswept, and lifeless. Except for one thing. A black truck sat half buried in sand, its door hanging open, smoke rising from the hood. Maria slammed the brakes. "There!" Cole jumped out before the jeep had stopped moving, sprinting toward the wreck. A figure lay sprawled beside the vehicle, one of the contractors, unconscious, his face bruised and covered in dust. The man's tranquilizer rifle was bent in half, hoofprints scattered around him. Aurora approached slowly, ears back, nostrils flaring. She snorted once, sharply, as if confirming the truth. Cole knelt beside the man, checking for a pulse. "Alive," he muttered. "They didn't all make it far." Evelyn crouched next to him. "What the hell happened here?" Cole stood, scanning the horizon. Aurora did. Maria frowned. "You think she attacked them?" He shook his head. "No. She defended him until she couldn't." He turned to Aurora. "Where's Halo?" The mare lifted her head, eyes fixed on the distant canyon walls. "There," Cole said softly. They found the second truck wedged between 2 cliffs, its tires shredded, one door twisted open. Inside, tranquilizer darts scattered, broken crates, and the faint smell of chloroform. And near the rocks prints, smaller, lighter, hoofprints. Evelyn gasped. "That's Halo's gate. He escaped." Cole smiled for the first time in hours. "He's alive." Maria's radio crackled faintly, the interference easing. "This is field control to Torres, copy if you can hear us." She snatched the receiver. "Control, we copy. Tracking abductors 2 trucks down, 1 unaccounted for. Confirm immediate backup." "Copy that," came the reply. "Air support en route. ETA 20 minutes. Evelyn exhaled. Finally. But Cole wasn't listening. He crouched near the ground, studying the prints. Halo's tracks led away from the truck, down a narrow gorge, and then split suddenly, as if he'd turned to face something. Beside them, deeper impressions appeared, human footprints, heavy, deliberate, and then drag marks. Cole's breath caught. "They're on foot. One of them still has him." Maria glanced at the horizon. "Then we move now, before air support spooks them." Aurora whinnied, stamping the ground. Cole met her gaze. "Go," he said quietly, and the mare ran. The chase through the canyon felt like something out of another world. The morning sun cut through the stone walls, painting streaks of fire across the sand. Aurora's hooves threw up clouds of dust as she surged ahead, her mane streaming like white flame. Cole followed on foot as fast as his injured leg would allow, adrenaline numbing the pain. Behind him, Maria and Evelyn kept pace, their radios alive with bursts of static and coordinates. Up ahead, a shout, then a gunshot. Cole's heart lurched. Halo! He rounded the bend to see a man, one of the remaining contractors, dragging Halo by a rope around the neck. The young horse struggled, rearing in panic, eyes wild. Drop it! Cole shouted. The man turned, raising his rifle. Stay back! Aurora screamed a sound that split the air like thunder and charged. The man fired, but the dart went wide. She hit him full force, knocking him to the ground. The rifle skidded across the sand. Cole lunged forward, cutting the rope from Halo's neck. The colt stumbled free, trembling but alive. Evelyn ran up, shouting, "We've got him! He's okay!" Maria tackled the contractor as he tried to crawl away, slapping cuffs onto his wrists. Cole dropped to one knee beside Halo, brushing the sweat and dust from his coat. "You're safe now, boy." Aurora stood over them both, sides heaving, her eyes locked on Cole's. In that moment, surrounded by chaos and sunlight and the roar of distant helicopter blades, a quiet understanding passed between them. It wasn't ownership, it wasn't taming, it was trust. By noon, the site was secured. Federal helicopters circled overhead, men in uniform swarming the canyon. The captured contractors were escorted away, their gear confiscated, unmarked tranquilizer guns, signal jammers, and forged BLM credentials. Paige Anderson arrived by helicopter soon after, her face pale but resolute. "I saw the footage," she said quietly. "Everything." The live feed kept rolling after the interference cut out. Evelyn frowned. "How?" Paige glanced at Ben, who was standing beside the mobile unit, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Redundant uplink," he said. "You told me to make sure no one could bury this, so I didn't." Maria clapped him on the shoulder. "Kid, you just saved a herd." Paige turned to Cole. "You also saved something bigger. The department has issued a permanent protection order for Aurora's herd, effective immediately." Cole blinked, hardly believing. "Protected? No more roundups?" She nodded. "No more. They'll live wild, untouched. Your data, your footage, it changed everything." Evelyn exhaled, smiling for the first time in days. "It's over." Cole looked toward Aurora and Halo, standing side by side at the mouth of the canyon. "No," he said softly. "It's just beginning." Weeks later, the desert was quiet again. The Joshua Tree Field Station had become a sanctuary, not just for the horses, but for the people who had fought for them. Researchers came from across the country to study the Mojave recognition phenomenon, as the media called it. Evelyn led the research program. Maria coordinated with conservation teams. Paige became the unexpected voice for reform inside the BLM. And Cole? He stayed. He rebuilt an old observation cabin on the ridge overlooking the canyon where Aurora's herd grazed. Every morning, he'd sit on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the horses move across the desert like living constellations. Sometimes Aurora would glance up, as if checking that he was still there, and every time, Halo would rear slightly 3 short paw strikes in the sand. The same signal as before. Cole always smiled. "Yeah, I see you too, kid." But peace never stays long in the desert. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sand in gold, a government courier arrived by jeep. Dust trailed behind him like smoke. He handed Cole a sealed envelope marked Department of Defense, eyes only. Cole frowned. "You sure this is for me?" "Name's right there," the courier said, tipping his hat before driving away. Evelyn joined him on the porch. "What's that?" "Don't know." He tore the seal open. Inside was a single page, no letterhead, no signature, just a printed line of text and a small photo paper clipped to the corner. The line read, "Project Sable, field recovery phase initiated." Cole's heart slowed. The photo showed a young Mustang Halo wearing something new around his neck, a small, dark collar with a blinking red light. Evelyn saw his face pale. "What is it?" He handed her the paper. They tagged him. She stared. "But who? The BLM?" "No," Cole said, his voice low, certain. "This isn't BLM, this is military tech." Aurora's distant cry echoed across the desert, sharp and frantic. Cole turned toward the sound. Beyond the ridge, dust was rising again, too uniform, too straight, too fast. Engines. He looked at Evelyn, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're coming back." The wind shifted, carrying the first faint thrum of helicopters. Aurora reared in the distance, white against the dying sun, her silhouette framed by the coming storm. Cole clenched his fists, jaw set. Not this time. The sound of rotors grew louder, shaking the sky.